Now, what gives us meaning in life? It is a question countless intellectuals and ordinary citizens have spent years pondering. Well, award-winning philosopher Rebecca Neuberger Goldstein says it's our desire to matter that drives us. She argues that this most crucial and basic instinct shapes our identity, culture, relationships, and even our conflict with one another. Goldstein shares her insight and analysis with our Walter Isaacson.
Thank you, Beata and Rebecca Neuberger Goldstein. Welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be here.
About 40 years ago, you wrote a very famous novel, The Mind-Body Problem. Tell me how this book, The Mattering Instinct, came out of that novel.
Yes. So that was a surprise because I was a young, untenured professor of philosophy of science, philosophy of math. I certainly wasn't expected to write a novel, but it came to me. And it was very exciting to hear this other voice speaking in my head. And the editor who acquired it in our first meeting, he was as young as I, Jonathan Galassi. He since has become a very famous editor. And he asked me a very precise, acute question, which was this. Your main protagonist is very good-looking, sexually desirable, very bright, very funny, and she's so miserable. Why is she so miserable? And I thought about that. And then, I heard her answering me. And it was in terms of this concept of mattering. What she had to tell me was she didn't feel that she mattered in the way that most mattered to her. And that's what first got me started on this deep need that people have to feel as if they matter, and then the great diversity of ways in which people respond to this shared need to feel that they matter. So it was by way of this novel, which was considered by my colleagues to be such a frivolous thing for me to be doing. And in fact, it gave me what has been, in fact, my mattering project to try to understand this mattering instinct and the way that it operates in our species.
You call it the mattering instinct. Explain to me why it's an instinct.
It's not exactly an instinct, as I explained in the book. It's the result of two other instincts. In fact, one of the instincts is deeper than an instinct, and that is that all living things, in some sense, matter to themselves. They're going to be first and foremost, striving for their own survival and flourishing. And that's kind of an organizing principle of all the instincts. And in us, we also have this capacity because we have these enormous brains that we've evolved for other purposes. But this brain has the capacity for self-reflection. So we can sort of step outside of ourselves and interrogate ourselves and think, am I really worth all of this attention that I am determined by biology to give myself? And that's what results in this mattering instinct, to try to prove to ourselves that we're really deserving of all the attention that we give ourselves in order to pursue our lives.
Is it evolutionarily caused?
Yeah, it is. I can tell. In fact, I even start further back than evolution. I start with physics, with the second law of thermodynamics, the supreme law of physics, that entropy increases, which means that all living things are constantly fighting against entropy. And so they have to be giving their own persistence and thriving top priority to strive to defy the law locally of entropy. And from that, we get the laws of biology. And that can take us all the way, as I tried to show, to this longing to matter. But then we're left on our own. If free will exists any place, it's here. How we decide to respond to this longing to matter, to prove to ourselves that our existence is worth all the attention we give it.
Does it relate to empathy?
I think trying to understand how the mattering instinct operates in others is part of what it is to empathize, to try to get a sense of what their subjectivity is like, what it is like to live that life. We all know people live very, very different lives. And part of this narrative of how they're living their life is shaped by how they're trying to respond to this need to prove to themselves that they matter. For some people, it really is their social connections. It really is, their family. It's just, the need for connectedness and the mattering instinct are collapsed into one thing. But for others, it's their, it could be the relationship with God or something spiritual. And that's what really gives them the sense that they matter in the universe. In fact, that's a very grand, very full notion of mattering in the universe, that you were intentionally created by that which created the starry heavens above and the moral order within, in Kant's language. For others, it's who I call heroic strivers. It's certain standards of excellence that they need to fulfill in order to reconcile themselves with themselves. It could be intellectual, it could be artistic, it could be athletic, it could be entrepreneurial, it could be military, it could be ethical. Steve Jobs, whose inner life you know better than maybe he knew himself, had this statement, try to live to make a dent in the universe. This is the expression of a heroic striver. And then there are people who really think about mattering in competitive terms. It really means mattering more than others. They really see mattering in zero-sum terms. The more others matter, the less they matter. So it's a very competitive approach to mattering. I've been spending the last 40 years just talking to people about it because I found that the best conversations I can have with people just open up, and the stories they tell about how they try to prove that they're not nothing, that their existence is something. Just the diversity is extraordinary.
Well, this instinct to matter in this cosmos in which we find ourselves, is that always a good and healthy thing, or can it be a problem?
It is. I would say, in fact, our greatest achievements as a species and our greatest atrocities come from this mattering instinct, and which is not so surprising, because I think it really gets to what it is to be human, what makes this species so different from even our closest primate relatives. And we are capable of incredible achievements, incredible, compassion and achievements and knowledge and art and athleticism, all sorts of things. But also we are capable of extraordinary atrocities.
How does this arise out of your philosophy of mathematics and science?
Yeah, well, I try to be very precise about it. I was trained in analytic philosophy, and in analytic philosophy, rigor is very, very important, defining your terms. And one of the things about analytic philosophy, as opposed to what's often called sort of a continental philosophy, these are outdated terms, but is that it takes science very, very seriously. And so to me, science doesn't destroy these questions of meaning and mattering and values and what it is to live a good life. It doesn't undermine them. In fact, we can use science, use the second law of thermodynamics, use theory of natural selection to try to gain insight into why we have this need, and then how we could best appease it. It's a longing. We never really know for sure. There's a lot of doubt in living a human life. And people who don't recognize this, who are so certain of their way of doing it and think everybody ought to do it, or they are nothing, they don't matter, they often cause a lot of trouble in the world.
Well, you talk about a lot of stories in the book, some leading down a bit of a dark path. Tell me about, I think, Frank Mehink was one of them.
Yeah. So he might be the most amazing person I ever spoke to. He came from a very, very poor background, a dysfunctional family. His mother was a drug addict. His stepfather was a brute who would beat him up. And he had a real sense of not mattering. And he came in contact with some neo-Nazi skinheads. And they told him, and they used the language of mattering. You know, look in the mirror. You will see that, of course, you matter. He was 13 at this time. He already dropped out of school. You are a white, male, heterosexual American. You matter by your racial identity, and these other people are stealing it from you. This was a notion of, zero-sum mattering, and so that, to the extent, but it was group mattering. To the extent you belong to a certain group, you matter more than these other groups. And as they're rising in mattering, they're taking away what is rightfully yours. And so he became a full-blooded, full-time neo-Nazi skinhead activist, arrested as a felon at 17, put away, met some black guys in jail that he really bonded with. And he began to see through this ideology that had made him feel that he mattered. And he's still terrifically anti-Semitic. And he said, in fact, he held on to that with even more vengeance because it was the one thing that tied him to his sense of mattering, that somehow the Jews were behind everything. And then he met a very nice Jewish man who employed him when nobody else would, even though he had a great big swastika tattoo on the side of his neck and his knuckles spelled out skinhead, so that when he beat people up, they would know why they were being beaten up. He completely reversed himself. I would say he became what I call an ethical heroic striver. He has devoted himself to trying to fight ideology. So he's just, people can change what I call their mattering project.
We have somebody on more the other side. I think it's Lo Shuaying. Can you tell me her story about being a scavenger but helping kids?
Yeah. We tend to think of heroic strivers, those who have some standard of excellence that they need to achieve. And that's what makes them feel worthwhile, whether others know about this or not. It can be very, very private, not public. And she, to me, is, it really exemplifies this kind of ethical achievement. She was a Chinese woman. She's now dead. I spoke to her daughter, Juju, and she grew up extremely impoverished. She lost her parents when she was 3 years old. It was during the Chinese Civil War. I don't even know how she survived, but she did. And she became a scavenger, picking up, garbage, going through the dumpsters for recyclables and bringing them to be recycled and earning her very meager living from this. Well, it was during the period of one child policy in China. And what she was finding in these dumpsters and public toilets and on the side of the road were babies, little girl babies who had been put out to trash because if you can only have one baby, well, then for various cultural reasons, families preferred it to be a boy. And so they left the girls out. And with a blank piece of paper pinned to them. And she, this impoverished woman, took these babies home and took care of them. She brought up at least 30 little babies, and she rescued many more and found homes for them. And it was so this was an extraordinary story, and it's the last story I tell. So you know what? We often don't pay attention to this kind of heroic striving.
Our society has been hit, we discuss it every week on this show, by populism, tribalism, authoritarianism. To what extent does that reflect in your mind a crisis of mattering?
Yeah, that's exactly how I see it, as a crisis of mattering. That our society, we have not paid enough attention to the fact that everybody has this longing. Everybody, wherever there is human life, there is a longing to matter, to not be nothing, to not be treated as nothing. And we've created a society in which there doesn't seem to be enough mattering to go around, in which, we talk so much about economic inequality, and that's a fact. But since we also judge how much people matter more and more by how much money they have, this has made people feel as if they don't matter. Maybe only the famous, the powerful, the rich matter, and this causes great resentment. The needs of mattering are being ignored, and if a leader can appeal to that, especially a leader who seems to be on a higher plane of mattering, very powerful, very rich, very famous, and say, I feel you, I'm one with you, you matter as much, especially if that leader himself may feel a dearth of mattering, being constantly needing to prove to himself how much he matters. So it's very, very authentic, this anger, but it's a shared anger, and you can, given the privation that many people are feeling as to their own mattering, it can create a very strong movement. I think we're seeing that.
Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, thank you for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.
Now, as President Trump mulls staying and running Venezuela for many years, our next guest argues his critics are falling into an obvious trap with their response to Maduro's capture and the subsequent fallout. In a new essay, The Atlantic's David Frum warns that opponents of the administration are getting bogged down in the legalities of the military operation, and he's joining Michelle Martin to explain why he thinks Trump's critics are getting it all wrong and why their message keeps failing to break through.
Thanks, Christiane. David Frum, thank you so much for talking with us.
Thank you.
You've been writing extensively about the U.S. incursion strike into Venezuela, seizing Nicolas Maduro and his wife, bringing him back to the U.S. to stand trial ostensibly for involvement in drug trafficking. Before we dig into a specific piece I wanted to talk about, I just wanted to ask you overall, what's your sense of that mission? What do you think?
People use the phrase regime change, but what we actually seem to have seen here is dictator change. The regime remains intact. Nicolas Maduro is not a charismatic dictator of the Fidel Castro type. He's an inheritor of a repressive military authoritarian system that was built by his predecessor, Hugo Chavez, who took power in the 1990s. So this regime has been there for 30 years. Maduro was the second in line. He inherited after Chavez died of cancer, and the system preceded him and can outlast him. So by removing him from the system, you don't necessarily change very much unless you change other things about the system too. But the Trump administration seems quite determined to leave the rest of that system intact, because I think they believe, this seems to be the thread of rationality, is the other people in the system are more amenable to pressure and maybe even more corrupt than Nicolas Maduro, as they can do business with them, while refusing to do anything to bring the legitimate, democratically elected government of Venezuela back to power. Venezuela had an election a year ago. It was intended to be a fake, but it was the will of the people was so strong that it overwhelmed the fake, and we now have a legitimate president of Venezuela recognized by the United States and other democratic countries.
So do you buy the administration's rationale for this? They're saying this isn't a war, so they didn't have to notify Congress or seek congressional approval. They're saying it's a law enforcement operation to basically interdict or interrupt a drug trafficking operation. Do you buy it?
Well, which one do I buy? Because I think there are at least three explanations of what has happened, and they contradict one another. So I can't believe them all. And when there are three different ones, I'm probably inclined to believe none of them. But so the one rationale is, yes, this is a law enforcement operation to seize somebody who's been indicted by a United States court. Another is, no, this is an anti-drug operation intended to stop the flow of drugs from Venezuela to the rest of the world. No. This is a war for oil intended to seize Venezuela's oil resources and annex them to the United States. Those can't
or to
all be
recover
true.
Or to recover oil resources that were improperly taken 20 years ago.
Or that's another. Maybe that's now four. So different people have the vice president has put forth an explanation. The president has put forth an explanation. The secretary of state has put forth an explanation. The secretary of defense, or secretary of war, as he likes to style himself, has put forward an explanation. But they're all contradictory. So which one should I believe?
There are a lot of reasons why people object. People from across the political spectrum are objecting to what just occurred here. But one of the things that you're saying in your piece, which got my attention, is you're saying that Trump's critics are falling into an obvious trap. What is the trap?
What Trump wants you to believe is this is a patriotic operation done by the skilled armed forces of the United States to serve an American national interest. It was heroically and faultlessly executed. And now there's just a lot of petty carping with international law, which no true American would ever care about. And it's just a lot of legalistic gibberish that is standing in the way of appreciating the great patriotic achievement. And one of the things I'm trying to say is whatever this was not done for the national interest. My guess, and this is only a guess, is that this oil talk, it reveals something real. I mean, obviously, seizing Venezuela's oil makes no economic sense for the United States.
Well, stop there for a second. Why not?
So the present price of oil is $58 a barrel. The United States of America is the largest producer of oil in the world. At $58 a barrel, American producers, many of them have trouble breaking even. Add Canada, which used to be a friend of the United States, and North America produces 28% of all the oil produced in the world. The idea that you need another 1 million barrels a day is crazy, especially when you consider how much will it cost to bring Venezuela's oil to market. The Venezuela oil reserves are located in jungly terrain in the far east of the country. There's been no meaningful investment there for 30 years. There aren't enough roads. It's heavy oil, which has to be brought it doesn't bubble spontaneously to the surface. You have to inject steam into the ground to bring the oil to the top. Steam takes electricity. Guess what there aren't a lot of in the jungles of eastern Venezuela? Hydroelectric power plants, or grids to connect them, or pumping stations. There aren't adequate security. So if there are insurgencies or guerrillas there, the whole thing is just bonkers. So for a fraction of the cost it would take to bring any Venezuelan oil to market, you can bring a lot more U.S. or Canadian oil to market. And the problem is the market is saying at $58 a barrel, actually, you know what? We got enough. We don't need more.
You've managed to articulate this in a very few minutes. You say that Trump's critics are getting it wrong. Where are they getting it wrong?
They're getting bogged down in legalisms. Because when you say this is about how Maduro was arrested, or when you say anything that carries any whiff of defense of this terrible dictator, you're allowing Trump to stage a false argument as if it were the true one. You're allowing him to claim that what has happened here is not something done for the national interest. There is we'll learn more about it. There's some shady element to all of this. And that's the place where you need to focus. And the problem is we're all kind of conservative in a small c sense. We all want to remember arguments we used to have and to think about a normal American presidency who does things for a normal American way. And it's just hard for people in Congress, a big institution, hard for people in the media to say, you know what, there's probably a corrupt motive here. And even if it's not immediately obvious, what that corrupt motive is, just wait 72 hours and it will become obvious. But don't start with the premise that what you're seeing here is Iraq or Panama or one of those previous struggles replayed. This is something different. This is about somebody having a get-rich-quick scheme. And we just it'll take a little while to discover who that somebody is.
It's interesting. Who do you think should be articulating that argument? Should it be members of Congress? Should it be public intellectuals like yourself? Who should be saying that?
I think there are things that members of Congress can think without having to say. Obviously, a member of Congress needs to wait if there is a corrupt scheme here. You don't want to say that until you have more proof of exactly what the corrupt scheme is. But they need to keep in mind that that's probably what is going on here, and not to allow old habits to drive them into the instinctive response to whatever international law means, that's what was violated here, because that will sound to a lot of Americans like just pettifogging and denigrating a great American military victory, when that's not what happened here. We haven't had a great American military victory. We've had a raid that's apprehended a genuine wrongdoer, but probably for reasons that won't bear a lot of public scrutiny when they're revealed.
In their sort of statements initially, most Republicans were on board. Most Republicans supported it. And Democrats are skeptical. But there are some Republicans who have expressed the same doubts that you have, who said that this doesn't make sense according to the market. It doesn't make sense according to past patterns of behavior. I mean, the president just pardoned the former president of Honduras, who was convicted of trafficking enormous amounts of drugs into the United States, convicted in an American court. And so they've pointed out the inconsistencies that you have pointed out. They've pointed out it makes no sense from a market perspective. Do you think any of those arguments are penetrating?
No, I think there's a habit here. So there is a long tradition, going back to George Washington's time, of arguments between more interventionist and more isolationist Americans. Those are very familiar arguments, complicated arguments, a lot of good faith on both sides. And I think there are people who would like to support Trump, who want to see us revert to the interventionist versus isolationist argument and say, well, President Trump pretended to be an isolationist. Now he's acting as an interventionist. He's contradicting himself. But at least we're back in our familiar landscape. And we don't have to adjust to the strange new world in which we live, where those arguments are not relevant to what's happening now. Trump is planning, apparently, or it's rumored or reported or claimed by members of the administration, to follow up what he did in Venezuela by doing a Pearl Harbor on Denmark. Now, whatever that is, that's not a part of our old isolationist versus interventionist arguments anymore, because there's never been an interventionist in American history who said what intervention means is doing a Pearl Harbor on a NATO ally.
Mm-hmm. So the question then becomes, though, if the arguments are as clear as you have articulated them, why aren't more people making them?
Because back of what I'm saying are some really upsetting things that we don't like to think about. I mean, a lot of people who are critical of this administration say, it's corrupt. It's corrupt. But there are other things going on. If you take that argument seriously, it's very upsetting. We don't have a presidency that has scandals. We have a scandal that is running a presidency. That the scandal is the story. And there are many particular scandals, but there's one big scandal, which is a president and his family using the office for self-enrichment on a scale not only never seen in American history, but never seen in the history of any democratic country at all. You have to look to post-colonial Africa or post-Soviet Soviet Union to see comparable billion-dollar scales of self-enrichment. And we want to believe that the country we grew up in, that we loved, the institutions we revere are there. And it's just hard. It's just hard to take on board the scale of what has been done to American institutions, especially in the second Trump presidency, but generally since 2016. A
lot of people think that one of the difficulties of America's culture right now is just a sort of a nihilism, a cynicism about everything. I mean, there's one sort of theory about the loss of confidence in the legacy media, for example. Is this too negative, too cynical? But you're saying it's the opposite. Is that there's a sort of a willingness and an unwillingness to really see something as clearly as it needs to be seen, to be as negative as the moment calls for.
in pro-institutional America, and especially, I mean, people who watch a program like this, we're older. We remember many presidents. We remember an America that, for most of us, has been a good place for us. We remember that America has been a force for good in the world. We remember the coming down of the Berlin Wall. We remember the spread of democracy in the 1990s. We remember the end of apartheid in South Africa, the end of the dictatorship in Chile, Taiwan and South Korea becoming democracies, Mexico turning into a multi-party democracy. That's, for me, that's yesterday. And we remember a United States in which there's dignity. And however foul-mouthed politicians are in private, when they appear in public, they're dignified. If someone dies, they don't mock the dead. And when you have a president who, when someone dies in the most tragic, horrific way, his instinct is, let me go mock that person. Let me see if the family's not miserable enough. Let me see if the president of the United States can add a little something to the family's misery. It's hard to adjust to that world. We don't want to be there. And so it's easy for those of us in pro-institutional America to say, okay, the real story here is what Marco Rubio is saying to the German chancellor, because that feels like America as we knew it.
What should members of Congress be doing right now?
If I had one wish, I would have a joint House and Senate resolution saying that any presidential order to attack the territory of a NATO ally is by that fact an illegal order, and obedience to it is an act of obeying an illegal order. Treaties of the United States are the law of the land. According to the Constitution, a treaty is every bit as much law as any statute of Congress. And if a president orders a general officer to attack a NATO ally without first canceling the NATO treaty, that's an illegal order. I'd like to see Congress pass that. I'd like to see Congress pass a resolution recognizing the winner, Edmundo Gonzalez, the winner of the 2024 election, the person recognized by the United States and almost all of America's allies and most countries in Latin America as the rightful president of Venezuela. I'd like them to put some muscle behind that. You don't want to send troops to Venezuela, but the goal should be bring Edmundo Gonzalez to lawful power and in a negotiated way. So that would be the best outcome. But you need to know where you're going, and bringing the proper legitimate president of Venezuela to power. That should be the American goal, not empowering the next dictator in line.
Why do you think it is that this administration is so reluctant to acknowledge this election? I mean, which, as you pointed out, most governments around the world have done.
Well, there may be a lot of petty reasons, but I think there's one big one, which is if you took this idea seriously, you'd be signing up for a big challenge. Venezuela was a very successful country from the 1950s to the 1990s. It fell into disrepair under Chavez and into chaos under Maduro. So bringing Venezuela back to what it used to be, using its oil resources for the benefit of the Venezuelan people, that's a big project. It also means that you'd have to stop seeing the quarter of the country that has been driven into exile, 8 million people. By the way, the largest group of them in Colombia, but many in the United States. You have to stop seeing them as invaders and threats and criminals who should be sent to torture prisons. And the act of repatriation is not one that involves a way stop at a torture prison, but involves some way to say, how do we take all the capital and the know-how that has left Venezuela and encourage it to repatriate, at least in part, and to reconstruct the country. This would be a big project. And one more thing, that one of the reasons they're reluctant to do it is if you want to do the project at reasonable cost to the American people, then you need partners. So, this is not going to be an American. We're going to work with Mexico and Colombia and Brazil.
Colombia. Mm-hmm.
And that we're going to do. I mean, I think when I think about how this military intervention went, how differently would it have gone if the president had delivered his message, not flanked by his own administration, but flanked by other presidents from Latin America, backed by a resolution of Congress. I think that wouldn't happen for this president, but I think a lot of people think, ending a dictatorship in Venezuela, helping that is rejected by his own people in a democratic vote, where it's a big reconstruction project. We need partners, we need friends, and we need permission from Congress.
Before we let you go, I want to loop back to where we started our conversation. And here's where I'm asking you to speculate. Do you have a theory about why this happened? As you pointed out, the administration has given multiple reasons, some of which are contradictory.
I have a guess. It's not really a theory. I think the United States has suffered this terrible flow of drug deaths from opioids, not from the drugs that come from Venezuela, which are mostly cocaine. The Trump administration, many of the people there feel those deaths very intensely, as they should, and want to do something about it. But they want to do something that blames foreigners, that says the reason Americans are dying is not because of things that are wrong in American life. It's not that we need some change in the way we do things here. It's someone else is doing this to us, the urge to blame others. Now, their first attention was to Mexico, which is where actually most of the fentanyl flows from. And before, in the year 23 and 24, there were a lot of talk from people who would become important in the Trump administration about actually using military action inside Mexico. And I wrote about this for The Atlantic. Once in power, it became clear this Mexico war scheme was not very feasible. And anyway, the Mexicans went very far to cooperate with the United States and with the Trump administration. But that urge to do something violent, to stop drugs that are blamed on others, not to look inward, but to look outward for a villain, I think that impulse shifted from Mexico to attach itself to Venezuela. And the irony, of course, is that there genuinely is a big drug flow problem via Mexico. There isn't such a big drug flow problem through Venezuela, but it was a place where those feelings could go. And instead of looking inward and saying, why is it that so many Americans are harming themselves in this way? And so many more than were harming themselves just 15 years ago. Why? What changes need to be made here so that Americans are less inclined to take drugs? They're met with better care when they get it. That anti-overdose remedies are more easily and freely available. Those are, all of that requires thinking and planning and not just anger and violence.
David Frum, thank you for talking with us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Next, a glimpse inside the glamour and the intensity of glossy magazine production in its heyday. Graydon Carter was the editor of Vanity Fair for 25 years, and in his new memoir, he reflects on his career adventures. He tells Walter Isaacson about the golden age of magazines and how he made it to the top from his humble beginnings.
Thank you, Chris John and Graydon Carter. Welcome to the show.
Walter, thank you.
You know, one of the things we biographers sometimes think about is that it's all about dad when it's a successful person. And then I'm reading this book, and your father is quite a character. Tell me, let's start there. Tell me about him.
Well, he was a pilot during World War II and flew Spitfires and Lancasters. He did not have what you would call a mind for business and had a business that did not do well after the war, but he loved flying, and he loved flying and sailing and skiing and golf. And he was, he was a character, and he loved wood. And he would take my brother and I, we were like, like 9 and 5 out to look for wood on the side of the road that the National Commission, Capital Commission, which was in Ottawa, where we grew up in, would go out there to get free firewood. He was quite cheap and would turn the thermostat down to 45 degrees at night. This is in a city where it would easily be 30, 40 below at night.
And so you actually worked as a lumberjack on lines. Tell me about some of those jobs and how that affected how you hired people when you got to be rich and famous.
Well, I never got to be rich and famous, but it did affect the way I hired people. My parents, like a lot of their friends, sent their kids out west to toughen them up and to, if you could, get a job as a lineman for the railroad. And then I went out and worked for 6 months for the Canadian National Railroad out on the Saskatchewan prairie. I lived in a boxcar with 11 other guys. Most of them had minor criminal records. They'd had a spot of trouble when they were growing up. And I overcame my fear of heights and learned how to climb telegraph poles. And I had one of the most great experiences of my life. And I adored all the guys I worked with. And so when I hired people, especially assistants when they're young, rather than sort of silver-plated internships, I looked for people who've worked in restaurants or worked at a dude ranch or done something with their hands. And I do think that if you're a waiter or waitress and you can handle 3 or 4 tables of 6 or 8 difficult diners, everything else in life is going to come easy.
You and I joined time together there and probably talk about when the going was good. Tell me about your first few months at Time when we were there.
Well, I mean, I arrived from Canada. I had, it was in the fall, but it was still warm, and I only had really warm clothing coming from Canada. I had an old blazer with a crest on it, and I wore it to a meeting, and somebody at the meeting asked if I worked as a a doorman. And so I was sort of slightly horrified. So I went back that night and I, with a razor blade, sewed the label, the crest off of my jacket. And it left a sort of a dark patch because the rest of the jacket had faded, and I looked even more foolish. But it was exhilarating for me. I mean, the rest of you guys, I mean, all of you, were incredibly talented and much smarter than the people I'd been around.
Tell me about that team that you came in with at time.
Well, it was you. It was Kurt Anderson, who became my partner at SPY. It was Michiko Kakutani, became a Pulitzer Prize winner and chief book critic of the New York Times. Maureen Dowd, a Pulitzer Prize winning critic for the Times. There was Pico Iyer, the wonderful writer. There was Jim Kelly, who became the editor of Time. There was Rick Stengel, who became the editor of Time. There was Steve Smith, who became the editor of U.S. News and World Report. Who am I missing here? Frank Rich, who became the chief theater critic for the Times.
I always thought that you were the consummate insider and also outsider. You could play both roles. Did you feel that way at Time?
No, I felt like an outsider, but I was dying to get into the melting pot and just melt. I tried to get rid of my Canadianisms. I tried to dress like an American. And I just wanted to sort of fit in with all you.
One of the subtitles for this book could have been Expense Accounts I Have Known. Tell me about your expense account at Time.
Well, it was the same as yours. And the fact is, I'd never had one before. And to be in your 20s, paying $200 a month rent in New York and having an expense account, I felt like I was in heaven. And I didn't cook a meal for the first 5 years. I don't think I turned on my oven once. I don't think I knew how to turn on my oven. And so to be able to go to restaurants, and I remember in those days, you rarely went out for lunch with one or two people that you didn't split a bottle of wine. And to me, it was just absolute nirvana.
Was there something profligate about that we should have reined back, knowing that it was going to be difficult in the future?
Oh, God, no. It wouldn't have changed a thing. First of all, I think the expenses were such a small line item in the overall cost of putting out Time. No, I think that is an important element in maintaining staff and keeping staff happy and committed. I mean, then I went to Condé Nast, where the expenses were exponentially greater. But Cy Newhouse, who ran Condé Nast, he wasn't just throwing the money out the window. He wanted to make Condé Nast the dominant magazine publisher in America, and he did.
And he did it by spending money even on like Annie Leibovitz, which helped define your Vanity Fair's look and feel.
100%. I mean, she was our principal photographer, and I remember one time we were $250,000 away from what she wanted for her contract and what we wanted to pay her. And I mentioned this to Cy, and he just said, "Oh, let's pay it." He said, "I don't want to nickel and dime her."
I love it when nickel and diming is referred to as $250,000 a year. So tell me about when you were at Time. I used to walk down the halls, and I'd see you and Kurt huddled together, and you were inventing SPY magazine. What was going through your head? Why did you decide, okay, we want to get out of Time and invent a new form of magazine?
Well, everybody else at the magazine seemed to be doing very well, and I knew that I wasn't cut out to be Time material. So
why is that?
I just wasn't. I wasn't Ivy League. I wasn't as buttoned down. I wasn't as good a writer, and so I could sort of read the writing on the wall, and I thought I had this idea for a magazine, and then I approached Jim Kelly first, but I think he knew he was going to be the editor at one point. And then I approached Kurt, and he was in right away. And so that over a 10-month period, we planned out the entire magazine.
Well, but you said you had an idea for a magazine. I love SPY, but tell me, what was the idea behind it?
It was just a funny, satirical, fact-based magazine about New York City, which was then, as you know, it had come out of bankruptcy or near bankruptcy. It was all of a sudden it was awash with this new money coming from investment bankers. Their wives were the ladies who lunched, and the city was sort of alive with a lot of characters showing off the money they had, and that's sort of great for journalism. And we wanted to write about that.
And it was basically poking fun at the pretensions of this elite, like in the tradition of H.L. Mencken way back on magazines. Tell me about, let's start with Donald Trump. How did he get to be a stubby-fingered vulgarian?
Not short-fingered.
Short-fingered vulgarian.
He'd be offended by stubby.
Yes, exactly. We don't want to offend him.
As he is by short. No, I was always in need of money because I had a number of kids, and so I took an assignment from GQ to write a story about him, and it was his first national exposure. So I spent 3 weeks with him, and he was very excited to have me around. And to be honest, I found him charming in a salesman type way. He uses your name like every 3 or 4 sentences, the way a tin aluminum siding salesman would use it. But in the story, I'd made the mention that I thought his hands looked too small for his body. So at Spy magazine later on, we came up with epithets for people, and we called him a short-fingered vulgarian that truly drove him crazy.
And how did Donald Trump react over the years on the short-fingered vulgarian? He sent you missives at times.
Well, firstly, he would send me nasty notes. Then he threatened to sue us. Then when I became the editor of Vanity Fair, the transactional Donald Trump, I think he realized that he better calm this feud, such as it was, down. And he tried to become friends, and we had dinner at Mar-a-Lago. I've had dinner with him and Melania. He invited me to one of his weddings, but it just couldn't hold. And so I would write something about him in Vanity Fair, and he would, once Twitter got started, he started tweeting horrible things about me. He would call me sloppy and dopey. He said my wife thought I was a total loser. He said the Vanity Fair was losing steam. The Oscar party wasn't hot. The food at our restaurant, the Waverly Inn, was terrible. And I blew up all these tweets about this large, and I framed them and had them all up inside my wall for visitors to see when they came to visit me.
You talk about him being transactional, that even though you had poked fun of him once you were powerful, he was trying to make it up. That's a theme of this book, too, whether it's Michael Ovitz or Donald Trump, all these people you pilloried when you were at Spy. They then all want to be transactional and make it up to you.
That was simply because of the chair I was sitting in at Vanity Fair. I think it was very important to them. And, I did my best to give them a fair shake, but Mike Ovitz was, then the most powerful man in Hollywood, and he had a dramatic fall. And we did 2 or 3 stories on that. And I always used to say the Vanity Fair was the magazine that if you rose to success, it'd be the magazine you'd want to have that story written about. And if you fell from those heights, it's the least favorite magazine you'd want to have written about.
How did the Vanity Fair job come along?
There was an intermediate period between Spy and Vanity Fair, and I edited this newspaper called the New York Observer. And it was a very sleepy Upper East Side newspaper. It was a broadsheet on salmon-colored paper. It was very well designed. But I took the job, and I thought I could make it a thing at a certain point, like readable, and then at some point a must read. And about 7 months in, I started sending complimentary copies to friends of mine that I'd met over the years, and to a lot of them, there were editors in Europe. And Cy takes an annual tour of all his properties in Europe.
This is Cy Newhouse, who runs Condé Nast.
Who owned Condé Nast and Vanity Fair and the New Yorker. And he stopped off in London and Paris and Milan, and he saw copies of the New York Observer in everybody's in-basket, and returned to America under the misguided impression that this was an international hit. So he called me in and he asked if I would be interested in 2 magazines. And I thought he was going to say something like GQ or Details, neither of which I could improve on. And he offered me either the New Yorker or Vanity Fair. And we had spent 5 years making fun of the writing style, the editor, the contributors at Vanity Fair. And so we settled on the New Yorker. And I spent the next 2 weeks working out a plan. I only told Jim Kelly, my agent Andrew Wiley, and my family about this. And the day that it was supposed to be announced, Anna Wintour called me and said, it's going to be the other magazine. And I thought, oh God, I don't have a plan for that. But I said, I'll take the job because we desperately needed the extra money. And the first 2 years were rocky because the people at the magazine, I don't think they fully trusted me because of Spy, but I thought if I just be myself and treat them fairly and compassionately, it'll work out. And I went 2 years without firing anybody. And in 1 week, I let 3 people go, which was more people than I'd let go and fired in my entire life. And then things sort of changed. People started coming around to the way I wanted the magazine to be, and we tried to change the house style of writing, and I wanted people to work together in a collegial, friendly, respectful manner. And for the next 23 years, it pretty much was that. And
you had some of the best writers in the business, and you just kind of recruited big names and gave them long form. Tell me about some of them.
Well, I went after writers. I wanted clever writers like Christopher Hitchens and James Walcott to be columnists. But I also wanted writers who could write big narrative stories that had a beginning, middle, and end. And they could run between 8,000 words and 20,000 words, but they had to be able to tell a story. So I had people like, Michael Hare and David Halberstam and Sebastian Junger.
And Michael Lewis and
Michael Lewis and Maureen Orth and Marie Brenner. It was and eventually we had about 50 writers on contract.
Why is that desire for brilliant long-form narrative fallen out?
It hasn't. It's just so expensive because I should have thrown Brian Burrow in there as well. It's just so expensive because a writer has to spend, 3 months, sometimes half a year on a story, and they've got to make a living, and we could afford to pay them during that period. Like when Dominic Dunn, he spent almost a year in Los Angeles covering the O.J. Simpson trial, and it was a big thing for Vanity Fair. He was a huge star, and that probably cost us $1 million a year or more for those stories.
Your relationship with Anna Wintour is carefully woven through the book. Tell me about her.
Okay, first of all, we were very good friends. I wrote for her for a number of years. She introduced me to Psy. She brought me into Condé Nast. She was a great and sort of cozy colleague, and we had a very good relationship. I think she started living up to this nuclear winter reputation. I didn't find that to be the case until much later in our relationship, but then eventually she became a little unpredictable when I met her, and I've said this in my book, but I was never sure when I saw her whether she'd treat me like one of her best friends or the parking lot attendant. And so when she became the editor-in-chief of Condé Nast, she made an attempt to try to take over half my staff and put them under her. And that sort of put a chill on the relationship, and it put a chill on my time at Condé Nast. I was coming up to my 25th year at Vanity Fair, and I thought it's time to do something different.
Graydon Carter, thank you so much for joining us.
Walter, thank you.
We return now to the United States with a closer look at what is happening in the White House and why. From ICE's violent crackdown in Minneapolis and Trump's threats to invade Greenland, to the president's 70-minute speech at Davos, riddled with inaccuracies and verbal jabs. It's been a whirlwind of a few weeks. Our next guest writes that Trump's politics are not America first, they're me first. New York Times opinion columnist Thomas Friedman joins Walter Isaacson to discuss this rapidly changing world order with America and Trump at the helm.
Thank you, Bianna and Tom Friedman. Welcome back to the show.
Great to be with you, Walter.
Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney in Davos this past week gave a speech that I think it may be the most significant or one of the most significant in 80 years since Winston Churchill gave his Iron Curtain speech. And it was about, he said, the end of the American-led world order. Is that what's happening now?
Walter, you're asking a critically important question. I think it could be happening. I think that there are people within the Trump administration who are acting in ways that will inevitably make it happen. But I don't think we're there yet. And I think there's a lot of pushback against it. if from nowhere else than the financial markets, because you saw how the market reacted so negatively by Trump seeming to engage in what Prime Minister Carney called a rupture, basically, with the Atlantic Alliance.
And Trump has talked about things that are America first, but you have a column saying he's not really dealing with America first. It's kind of me first for him.
Yeah, I think that if you look at the history of American foreign policy, Walter, which you have, going back to your Kissinger book, you would say that the kind of rupture, the kind of 180-degree turn that we're seeing by the Trump administration on foreign policy, or attempted turn, is the kind of thing you'd only associate with a major war or a huge economic explosion to the downside. What is so striking about this moment is this is not happening in the context of a major war or some kind of economic collapse. It's entirely driven by the moods, attitudes, and superstitions of a president who is more unbounded than any president we've basically had in the modern era. He's a man of extreme views who is basically able to govern, at least for these 2 years, with the Supreme Court, the House, the Senate, and the White House entirely in his hands, but not only in his hands, with a Republican Party that has basically chosen to surrender its responsibilities for advice and consent from the Senate and spending power from the House to the president. So we've never seen this combination of a president with radical views on foreign policy, unbuffered entirely by the administration. And that's why you get this moment where there's no war, there's no economic crisis driving this. It's just the impulses of one man. So I'm loath to describe this as a permanent shift, because I don't think underneath it is the plumbing and wiring that requires such a shift. I think this so much is combusting in Trump's own head.
When Carney spoke at Davos, he talked about, he took up the cause of Václav Havel, who talked about the collaborationist instinct and how systems only work if people go along with things they know aren't true. Like they put the sign in the window saying, "Workers of the world unite," in the old communist Soviet Union, even though they don't believe it. And he said it's time for the rest of the world, especially middle countries like Canada, to take the sign down and say, this is all a fake. We're no longer going to play along. What do you make of that?
You know, Walter, by happenstance, I spoke at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver last week. And I was introduced by the director of the school. And in the process of introducing me, she referred to Prime Minister Carney's remarks in Davos, which had just happened the day before or 2 days before. And the audience just erupted in cheers. You got a lot more cheers than I did, okay? And my Canadian host, pointed out to me that in their grocery stores now, they have marked with Canadian flags, Canadian-made products. This is really not only insulting to them, but frightening to them. But the old saying, the enemy gets a vote. Canada is not our enemy, even if Trump is trying to present them that way. The world will push back. It'll push back through markets. It'll push back by, look at the price of gold, just as a proxy. What is that about? Okay, it's not just people, worried about the instability of the moment. It's central banks around the world putting their dollars into gold rather than U.S. Treasury bills. So the world gets a vote, and Donald Trump can steamroll, Lindsey Graham and Tom Cotton and his own party, but the world will push back. It will resist.
One of the ways Canada's resisting is it created an agreement with China now on more open trade. Do you think we could possibly see China taking advantage of all of this and becoming, in some ways, a de facto leader of the middle countries?
China will attempt to do that. It has its own problems, though. Its own asymmetric economic relationship with so many countries because it's overproduction. So I don't think that would be easy. I don't think there's any replacing America. But the reason China and Russia, Walter, have always voted Trump emotionally, if not otherwise, is because they actually understand America's secret sauce. They understand our single most important competitive advantage, which is they have vassals, China and Russia, and we have allies. And we have allies because we've had this kind of reciprocal relationship with them, or a relationship where we are actually overly generous because we believe to strengthen the system. And when the system strengthened, the biggest country in the system us benefited the most. So we have allies, they have vassals. And the one thing they have both tried to do for decades is, and that they've dreamt of doing, is breaking up NATO and breaking up the de facto American alliances in the Asian Pacific. And they never imagined a day where our own president would facilitate that.
One of the topics was Greenland, of course. And I thought when Trump was saying, we may invade Greenland, I thought that was just his reality TV show thing. And indeed, I don't think he ever was thinking of invading Greenland. But wasn't it important to push our NATO allies to do more in the defense of Greenland?
We have had a historic relationship with the sovereign in Greenland, the Denmark government, in partnership with the Greenland government, that basically has allowed us, since World War II, to build and stock and deploy both forward radar and whatever fighter jets we want anywhere in Greenland. We've had that relationship. And the notion that either Russia or China are moving on Greenland is ludicrous. There's no proof of that. There is concern that as the ice melts, there'll be a mineral grab over the Arctic. But the fact is, we have had all the military access to Greenland we need. Now, Trump insists, well, because we don't own it, somehow we can't invest enough in it. Well, we don't own Germany and we don't own Japan, but we've had forward bases there, since World War II. So the whole thing is just a ludicrous diversion by Trump for whatever reason, or obsession, or obsession. And, this notion I read that, us silly people, we take him literally, not figuratively. What the hell does that mean? When the president of the United States speaks, you're not supposed to take him literally? When he tells you, if you don't give me Greenland, you'll see what's going to happen to you.
Let me ask you about the Davos European internationalist consensus over the past 60 years or so. Didn't it get some fundamental things wrong, including the rewards of globalization not being distributed fairly, that has caused this backlash and caused people like President Trump and others around Europe and the world to have a populist backlash against this?
Well, let's see. Last time I checked, more people grew out of poverty faster in India and China than any time in the out of absolute poverty than any time in the history of the world. Now, you can say that their growth out of poverty came at the expense of American middle class in the Midwest in America, and that's true to some degree. And as a country, we should have done more to protect these people, to undergird them. But I do think that globalization has its upsides and its downsides. And our job was to take advantage of the upsides and to cushion the downsides. We didn't do enough of that in America when we needed to. At the same time, if you go to a lot of these towns now, they have, in their own way, lifted themselves up and transformed themselves with new industries and whatnot. It's not perfect. It's nowhere near what it should have been. But what's the alternative, Walter? Should we have opted for autarky? How did that work out when the world went that direction before World War I? So, there's an easy straw man at Davos, and there's an easy, comfortable self-congratulation there. Both are extremes. But at the end of the day, the fact is that the world that we have today, the world that has been relatively more prosperous, more peaceful than any period in history, is so much a product of America being the way America was, and the fact that you had a U.S.-China trading relationship in the middle of it, that without both of which, well, I don't want to live to see that world where both of those things break down, because when that happens, you will miss this period when it's gone.
Another reason, I think, perhaps for the populist backlash we're seeing in Europe and America was immigration, and immigration going too far, it seemed. Did we get some of that wrong, and is there a way to try to solve that issue?
I think we got it absolutely wrong. And I think Democrats, and particularly the last administration, have a lot to answer for. I've been advocating the same message on immigration now since Trump really made it an issue in his first administration. I'm for a very high wall. I am for a very high wall from one end of the Mexican border to another with a very big gate, okay? Because unless you can assure Americans that we are controlling our border, you are going to lose a lot of them when it comes to immigration. I'm super pro-immigration. I'm for the high-end, high-educated immigration, and I'm for any Haitian who can build a boat out of milk cartons and get to our shores. Wow, I want that person, okay? I want both the high energy and the high IQ immigrants. But we are not going to get them because we will not have a political consensus unless we can control the border. And that's why I urged in my column yesterday my brothers and sisters in Minnesota, whom I'm so proud of, for protecting their law-abiding, hardworking, culturally enriching neighbors, even if some of them are here illegally, okay? But at the same time, it's vital to me that Democrats, if they want to do well in the midterms, need to make it very clear they're for a high wall with a big gate. They're for legalizing immigration. Now, both parties, have had challenges on this, but the fact is Democrats came together under the Biden administration with Senator Langford of Oklahoma with a plan to actually overhaul all of immigration reform to give us what I call a high wall with a big gate. And Donald Trump killed the bill because he wanted to use this as a wedge issue.
You spoke about your most recent column where you speak as somebody who was born in Minneapolis and grew up in that area. Tell me, why is it coming apart so badly in Minneapolis? Why has this become the focal point for things?
Well, Minnesota is a classic example of a community that had some very rapid demographic changes, maybe too quickly for the state to fully absorb both immigrants from Somalia and more broadly. So that tension was there. At the same time, it is a community that has a legacy of a real social consciousness and wants to kind of make this work. And therefore, made itself Minneapolis a so-called sanctuary city that wasn't going to arrest or facilitate the arrest easily of illegal immigrants. And Trump knew it was a perfect place to try to, rather than calmly sit down, bring together, say, let me create a bill, for legalizing immigration and controlling the border. Let's work together with the people of Minnesota. He saw this as just a great way to pursue his own politics, which is the politics always of division, not addition. How do I divide? And so I win the election by 50.00001%. And that kind of leadership in this kind of hugely complex situation will give you this kind of explosion. But Democrats, just to say one thing, though, I really emphasize this in my column, Democrats need to understand, though, that there are a lot of voters in this country, and I'm one of them, and independents who are not good with just an open border. In my case, it's because I want immigration. I want more of it, but it's got to be legal immigration. And if we don't control the border, you will not have a national consensus for that. And that would be a tragedy.
Well, do you think that ICE has the right to be in Minneapolis?
I think there's no question that ICE, in theory, was created in part to control the border and to find illegal immigrants. We did that under Obama. We did that under Biden a little. We've done it all along. I'm for controlling the border. I'm not for what they did in Minneapolis, which was deliberate provocation of sending 3,000 people into a city to find not just illegal people, but to actually start pulling people out of their homes and stopping them on the streets just because they looked foreign. I look foreign. Heck, they could have pulled me off.
Let me read you something from your column that struck me as really strong words about ICE in Minneapolis. You say Hamas, referring to the Palestinian group that's been controlling the Gaza Strip. You say Hamas and ICE share one very visible trait that I never thought I'd see in the United States. Almost all of their foot soldiers wear masks. My experience as a reporter in the Middle East taught me that people wear masks because they are up to something bad and don't want their faces captured on camera. I saw it often in Beirut and Gaza. I never expected to see it in Minneapolis. Unpack that for me.
Walter, I don't understand. ICE is a federal agency charged with implementing the Constitution, federal laws. Why are they wearing masks? Why are they wearing masks? The Minneapolis police don't wear masks. The Washington police don't wear masks. Why are they wearing masks? I think it's something that really delegitimizes them, makes them look even more sinister, and makes me wonder what they're up to.
Tom Friedman, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Pleasure, Walter. Thank you.
Now, Trump's assault on higher education landed a big fish. Columbia University has agreed to pay over $220 million to settle their fight. Meanwhile, his administration's attack on the media is in full swing, with Congress approving drastic public broadcasting cuts and lawsuits that keep on coming. Just a day after CBS's decision to cancel the #1 late-night show with Stephen Colbert sent shockwaves, the president hit the Wall Street Journal with an unprecedented $20 billion libel suit. Hari Srinivasan unpacks all of this and the state of freedom of speech in America with David Enrich, Deputy Investigations Editor at the New York Times.
Christian, thanks. David Enrich, thanks so much for joining us. You wrote a book recently called Murder the Truth, Fear the First Amendment and a Secret Campaign to Protect the Powerful. You know, at the core of your book is a Supreme Court case that most of our audience are probably not familiar with. Most Americans aren't familiar with. 1964, New York Times versus Sullivan. Encapsulate that. Why is it such an important case?
In a nutshell, it established that if you're a powerful person, an elected official, a billionaire, someone like that, in order to successfully sue someone for defamation, you need to not only prove that you were defamed, so that someone got a fact wrong about you and that hurt your reputation. You need to go further than that. You also need to prove that whoever spoke or wrote that defamatory falsehood did so either knowing that what they were saying was false, so in other words, lying, or they did it with reckless disregard for the truth. And the Supreme Court created that high bar, knowing that it was really high and it would be hard to overcome. And the reason was that they wanted journalists and just members of the public in general to have the breathing room to know that they could criticize or interrogate or scrutinize powerful people in society without worrying that if they made an innocent mistake, a good faith error, that could subject them to basically bottomless, endless liability. And so that the Supreme Court decision in New York Times versus Sullivan really opened up this golden age of investigative journalism because it allowed people, reporters and others, to pursue ambitious targets and really try to uncover wrongdoing and hold people accountable without worrying that an innocent slip up could cause terrible financial damage for them.
You know, you go through a number of different challenges, the cases that have been played out, and you spend quite a bit of time on the case of Gawker and Hulk Hogan. For people a little unfamiliar with that, Peter Thiel, who we think of as a tech titan, was the force that was funding that. Why was that case so important?
Well, it became really important because Hulk Hogan won this lawsuit, basically bankrupted Gawker. And on its face, that was, you could understand why Hulk Hogan had sued Gawker. Gawker had published this sex tape of Hulk Hogan. It invaded his privacy. Easy to understand that. It turned out after the verdict that Peter Thiel had been in the background financing this. And he wasn't financing it because he liked Hulk Hogan. He was financing it because he had decided years earlier that he wanted to destroy Gawker because he was very unhappy with the website's coverage of him personally and of Silicon Valley in general. And the fact that Thiel had masterminded and bankrolled this plot sent real shockwaves through the media world because it showed that one billionaire with some patience and creativity, here was a playbook for them to basically kneecap news organizations whose views or whose journalism they didn't like. And I think for journalists, that was a very scary prospect that one angry man could basically destroy you. I think on the other hand, people who like to file such lawsuits and don't like the way they're covered in the media, this was a real moment of celebration. And people like Donald Trump saw this verdict and saw the outcome of it. And it was just, I think, really inspiring to them.
Now, is there this sort of reaction that, well, not just because Peter Thiel did it, but let me go ahead and sue the institution? Because if it's an institution like the New York Times, sure, they've got a fleet of lawyers and they can defend themselves. But if it's a smaller publication or just a single writer, they probably don't have the resources.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. And that's one of the real things I spent a lot of time tracking as I reported and wrote this book was that, I sit at the New York Times. I used to work at the Wall Street Journal. Those are big news outlets that have the resources and kind of the wherewithal to defend themselves, not only from lawsuits, but from legal threats that journalists often receive before they publish a big story. What I found, though, is that these threats and lawsuits are being used increasingly against smaller news organizations and independent journalists that have a lot less resources to fight back with. And the impact of that, and first of all, it's a deliberate effort, I found, often by rich and powerful people at either the national or sometimes the local level as well, to just shut down critical speech about them, and including journalism, but by no means limited to journalism. This is a tactic used against activists, just community members, things like that as well. And it's not just politicians doing it, it's big companies as well. And the tactics are often effective. I mean, they lead journalists, news organizations, lawyers to really start pulling punches because they are faced with a really difficult choice between standing up to these legal threats or these lawsuits, which often do not have a firm basis in the law, but standing up to them can imperil you financially. And on the other hand, it's often easier and kind of financially rational, I think, to just pick a less controversial and a less litigious target. But the result of that is often that you are essentially engaging in self-censorship. That means that important stories aren't covered, wrongdoing doesn't get exposed, people aren't held to account for their actions. And, that's the role that journalism is supposed to play in the society going back hundreds of years to the formation of this country. And so I think it's a really potentially severe problem.
Well, what has happened in this second Trump administration now? There seems to be tactically a very different approach that the administration is taking now versus the first time around.
Yeah, I mean, the first administration now looks like a bit of a warm-up act for what we're seeing in the second administration. And I mean, Trump's rhetoric has gotten increasingly incendiary. But I think more important than that, his actions speak louder than his words, and his actions are really profound in a lot of ways. And it's a whole range of stuff. I mean, and he's suing news organizations. He is threatening news organizations. That's kind of the plain vanilla stuff. I mean, he is kicking news outlets out of the White House, restricting how they can cover things because he does not like their choice of language or the way they've written about things. The White House is asserting control over which news organizations and which journalists can travel with the president, can have access to the Oval Office. The administration has gutted long-standing news organizations like Voice of America. There's obviously been a widespread effort, not just in the White House, but in Congress as well, to strip organizations like PBS and NPR and their member stations of funding. And, that these are all things that I think have been on, or at least some of them have been on the conservative agenda for years. But I do not think it's a coincidence that we have a president who, in an administration that is really hell-bent on demonizing the media and avoiding the scrutiny that the media would normally bring to a very polarizing and controversial administration. And they're actually getting what they want. not just in terms of the actions they're taking, but legislatively as well. So I think there's a lot of stuff going on here, but it's clear this is a lot more substantive, and I think from a media standpoint, potentially dangerous than what we saw the first time around.
Just a point of information and full disclosure, the conversation that our audience is watching right now is produced by a public media station. So we are in ways part of this story. You wrote a fascinating piece recently, not just about the politics and the press, but really just about corporations as well. And you focused in on United Healthcare. Tell our audience a little bit about kind of the tactics that United Healthcare is using now to basically quash public dissent.
Yeah. Well, I mean, United Health is one of the, I would say, most controversial companies in the country right now. It's facing enormous criticism for many of its business practices. People are really angry at them. And it have been going to platforms like TikTok and YouTube and to criticize the company. And since the murder of one of their top executives last December, United Health has gotten much more aggressive in fighting back against this. And they've done things like basically threatened to sue a doctor who posted a video on TikTok that criticized the company. They've gone to streaming platforms like Amazon Prime and Vimeo and pushed those platforms to remove material that was critical of the company. They've gone after local journalists and people working at community news organizations. And the list kind of goes on here. And I think one of the things, and to some extent, these tactics are indeed working. And there are platforms like Prime Video and Vimeo removed things at the request of United Health. And it leads to a real kind of rising tide of self-censorship that insulates not just politicians, but also big, powerful companies like United Health from criticism and from scrutiny at the exact moment when that scrutiny and accountability, I think, is most needed.
So, for the record, a spokesperson for United Health in your story was quoted saying the truth matters, and there's a big difference between criticism and irresponsibly omitting facts and context. When others get it wrong, we have an obligation to our customers, employees, and other stakeholders to correct the record, including by making our case in court when necessary. I want to ask specifically about, say, for example, the Walt Disney Company that settled a lawsuit against the Trump administration had brought against ABC News, and now the Paramount Corporation that settled in a different way for kind of a different reason. What are those? Why are those important? Because technically, you could look as a bean counter and say, this is just part of doing business. I'm just doing a cost-benefit analysis. I don't want the administration on my back. So what if I just write a $15 million check to a presidential library? Versus saying I'm going to stand up for press freedoms?
Well, look, I mean, this is a feature, for better or for worse, of having major companies owning news organizations. And I mean, I think it is to a certain extent the bean counters making the decision here. For a company like Disney that has tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue, cutting a check for $15 million, so a lawsuit against ABC News goes away, is quite possibly a rational thing to do. And same for Paramount, which has a multi-billion-dollar merger pending that needs federal approval. I think the problem is that it sets a precedent that shows journalists that their parent companies do not have their back. And it sends a message to not only to Trump and his administration, but any other rich and powerful person anywhere in the world, or at least anywhere in the country, that it's open season on journalists and that these attacks can work and that they are working. And it encourages people to further weaponize the legal system to crack down on companies, news organizations, and journalists whose coverage is critical or unfavorable. And again, I think the most important thing here is that the lawsuits that Trump has been filing against ABC, against CBS, against the Des Moines Register, against the Wall Street Journal, most recently, they appear to lack legal merit based on the substance of the complaints and the underpinning interpretation of the law. And yet you're seeing these companies like Disney and like Paramount basically bending a knee to Trump just to make this stuff go away. And that's exactly what he wants. And, when I talk to people in his camp about this, they celebrate these victories and say very openly, I think, that this is emboldening them and that the tactics are working and that they're going to keep using these tactics going forward.
Most recently, Paramount, the parent company that owns CBS, has the Late Show with Stephen Colbert. They announced that they were going to finish The Late Show, with a multi-decade long brand. Their rationale for it is that just financially it doesn't make sense anymore. And I wonder, now there's a lot of speculation wondering how much of this is business versus how much of this is, silencing a critic in Stephen Colbert, especially days after he criticized the very bargain that Paramount struck with the government.
Yeah, and I don't know what the truth is here, but it's impossible to ignore the timing of it. And it certainly, at the very least, it's quite a coincidence that shortly after Colbert criticizes the settlement with Trump, his show is canceled. And the way I look at it is that CBS and Paramount have resolved the lawsuit that Trump filed by paying off Trump. But there's another party to this, and they still need to get the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, to approve this multi-billion-dollar deal. And it's pending. And so sending a signal to the Trump administration that you are going to shape programming in a way that will be less objectionable to the White House, that does send a signal to the White House that you're playing ball. And certainly Trump has stated publicly since the show was canceled that he applauds this and he takes credit for it. Now, I don't know if that's actually what happened here, but that's certainly the way the White House seems to be interpreting it.
Yeah. There is a lawsuit that is now been filed against Rupert Murdoch for $10 billion against the Wall Street Journal for a story that they published just last week about Jeffrey Epstein and whether or not the president had written this kind of tawdry birthday note, et cetera. But my question to you is, what happens inside a newsroom, considering you've worked at both the Journal and the Times now, when there is a lawsuit like this, at least at a place where you do have a fleet of in-house and outside counsel that can help defend your rights?
Well, I mean, what happens is that your lawyers and basically start circling the wagons and trying to figure out what is happening, what documents need to be preserved, who might need to be deposed in the future. And on the surface, it's like not a problem because these lawsuits tend to lack merit. It's clear in the Journal's case that assuming they did not make up this letter that Trump supposedly wrote to Epstein, that they're on pretty solid legal ground because the truth is always a defense against defamation claims. But look, being sued by anyone, and much less the president of the United States, is a scary prospect. And I don't know how the reporters at the Journal are feeling, but I can tell you how I've felt when I've been sued over much lesser things. And it's a terrible feeling. It's scary, and it makes you question what you should be reporting on in the future, even if you know intellectually and in your head that that you're on safe ground. And so I think that is one of the intents of lawsuits like this, is to get journalists thinking twice about whether they really want to speak critically about Trump or his allies, because that might result in legal action, which has a potential to drag on for years. And even if you work for a big institution like the Wall Street Journal, that's a cloud that's going to be hanging over your head and causing you to lose sleep at night.
One of the things that I found interesting about your book is that it's as much a story about this court case and the kind of legal battles as it just is about just money and power and the way that power is exerted in so many different ways that we're not necessarily seeing the through line. Help our audience understand how kind of power is transacted and why it's so important in this tussle.
Well, look, I mean, we right now have a strong First Amendment. We have precedents that have interpreted the First Amendment in a very robust way that offers a lot of protection. But there are a lot of people with a lot of money and power that are on this very well-coordinated campaign to roll back a lot of those protections. And that's an expensive proposition, and it requires a lot of time and energy and money. And what I found that's happening, and really all over the country, is that there are a lot of lawyers, activists, academics, politicians who are working in lockstep, often through well-financed organizations like the Heritage Foundation and the Federalist Society, to really not only change public opinion, but change the opinion of the few people that really have the power to alter the law, which are the justices of the United States Supreme Court. And the goal here is, in large part, to roll back New York Times versus Sullivan so that it becomes not only easier for powerful people to sue news organizations and members of the public, but also so that the risk-taking calculus inside a news organization or even a member of the public changes, and that it becomes riskier and potentially much more expensive to speak critically or even to scrutinize or investigate powerful people and institutions. And that creates, and that can further kind of tilt the playing field in favor of powerful people and organizations and companies, and away from those who are trying in their professional lives or even in their personal lives, trying to speak up what they speak of truth to power. And I think that's a shift that's been underway for a long time, but it's definitely been accelerating in the past several years.
New York Times journalist and author of the book Murder the Truth, David Enrich, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Now, about 40% of Americans will be diagnosed with a type of cancer at some point in their lives. It's an alarming statistic, made even more so by the fact that cancer research itself is under threat in the United States, with the Trump administration continuing to slash millions of dollars in vital funding and leaving countless families scrambling for options. Staff writer for the New York Times Magazine, Jonathan Mahler, is investigating just what kind of impact these cuts are already having across the country. He joins Hari Srinivasan to discuss his findings.
Christian, thanks. Jonathan Mahler, thanks so much for joining us. You wrote a piece in the New York Times Magazine recently, and it's titled, "Trump is Shutting Down the War on Cancer." And you take so many different approaches in this piece. Let's, I guess, start with first. What do you mean by this? Give me the scale of the war on cancer and what he's shutting down.
Yeah. So, I mean, the war on cancer is something that we started, launched in this country, back in 1971. President Nixon actually signed the legislation, the National Cancer Act. And really what it was a commitment to make a sustained, large investment in treating cancer and improving our treatment of cancer. And over the decades, that investment has grown steadily. And now we've reached a moment where we're poised for even greater breakthroughs at the very moment that the Trump administration has decided that we're spending way too much money trying to cure cancer. And the war on cancer, it's happening both in terms of the cancellation of individual grants, so individual projects that were dedicated to discovering kind of new treatments or adapting new treatments. It's happening in terms of freezes in funding to research universities that depend on NIH money to keep their labs running, are suddenly finding that money frozen, not appearing. And then it's happening on a kind of a even larger scale. And this is something that's still a little bit to be determined. But the president's proposed budget for next year, which is still before Congress, is calling for a 38% cut to our cancer research budget, which is $3 billion. I mean, this is a lot of money. In addition to that, the administration is trying to lower the reimbursement rate that research universities get for their overhead expenses. So, universities that are conducting this research, they have scientists who are doing the work, but they also have to keep the labs running. They have to, employ people to administer the grants. They have to pay for the electricity, et cetera. They're able to expense some of those costs, and the administration wants to dramatically lower the reimbursement rate for universities. So it's really a kind of a 360-degree attack on this funding system.
Give me an idea, or give our audience some perspective here, and set the level. Okay, this has been happening for decades. How successful has that war been? I mean, we're spending billions and billions of dollars every year. I get that. But is there a way that you can measure what a dollar gets us?
Yeah. So, I mean, my favorite statistic is, which was published recently in the Journal of Clinical Oncology, is that about every $300 that the government spends on cancer research extends someone's life by 1 year. So, that feels like a pretty modest investment to me as someone who lost his mom to cancer. Seems to me, pretty worth it. To say nothing of the fact that there are enormous economic benefits to this investment too. I mean, the biotechnology industry, the pharmaceutical industry, all of these and all the investors in these companies have all made an enormous amount of money off of the research that began on this basic biological level funded by our government.
And so when somebody gets a cancer today versus perhaps our parents' generation, what is the likely outcome? Are we more likely to survive it? Are there fewer cancers that are kind of untreatable?
Our ability to treat cancer has been dramatically transformed, particularly since the 1990s. So really, if you think about how this whole war on cancer has unfolded, the first 20 plus years were really a period where scientists were mostly grappling with how much more complicated this disease was than they had realized. It's not a single disease. It's hundreds of thousands of diseases, and each one behaves differently on every organ and in everyone's body. And really, beginning in the late 90s, what had been basically the only options historically had been surgery. Really. And then, chemotherapy came along and radiation as well. But these were, both radiation and chemotherapy are enormously toxic and not always effective. But what the really the biggest innovation and the innovation that scientists are still really building on is what's known as immunotherapy. And immunotherapy is essentially the use of one's immune system to the stimulation of an immune system to detect the mutant cancer cells and fight the cells itself. So your immune system does the work that otherwise these toxic chemotherapy chemicals would be doing, which people tolerate much better. So their quality of life during treatment is much better, and it's also much more effective. So this is a new, immunotherapy is relatively new. We're talking about, 15 years or so. And there's still a lot of cancers where they're just beginning to understand how to use immunotherapy.
To illustrate what's happening kind of in the research ecosystem, you help kind of personalize it by looking at Rachel Sirianni, a professor at the University of Massachusetts. Her research focuses on an aggressive form of pediatric cancer known as medulloblastoma. Tell us her story and how it's indicative of what's happening to other researchers, people who are facing grants.
She's working on basically a new way to deliver drugs into the interior of the brain to attack this very aggressive form of pediatric brain cancer, which kills hundreds of kids every year, medulloblastoma. And so she's been working kind of steadily on this for 10 years now, and she had 3 NIH grants to do this work, was making great progress. Her grants were, just because they only last for 5 years or so, were coming up in 2025 and 2026. So coming into this new year and the new presidential administration, she was aware that she needed new grants to keep her research going. She runs a lab with 7 researchers and technicians, and it's expensive and time-consuming work running all these studies. So she had submitted 2 grant applications to keep her work going to the NIH, and days after the inauguration, she was informed that the meetings where her grants were going to be considered had been canceled. And so months now went by. She had to start laying people off in her lab. She had to cancel one of her most promising studies. And then she was informed that in June that neither project was going to be funded. So now she's faced with this decision of, well, what am I going to do? This is this important work that I'm devoted to, that I've been doing for years now, and I'm making great progress. And she's come to this decision now that she, for the moment at least, she can't really focus on this work any longer, because pediatric brain cancer work is very expensive. It's expensive because it requires a very specific kind of lab mouse. So now she's decided she's going to have to just pivot away from it and start working in some other fields, which is obviously, tragic. I mean, this was a woman who was making great strides in helping children with brain cancer survive. And I mean, it's hard to imagine, something more worthy for our government to be investing in. And yet, here she is having to move to other fields.
So, we're in a period now where you said that in the mid-70s, America's 5-year cancer survival rate sat at 49%. Today, it's 68%. That's startling, considering how relatively new immunotherapy is, and perhaps some of the work that's happening with mRNA research that could impact cancer. Is this a productive time for cancer research?
Many people whom I spoke with said that this is one of the most productive moments, if not the most productive moment in the history of cancer research, because we have all of that accumulated knowledge. We have all of this new technology. We have artificial intelligence. There's so many sort of forces coming together. There is, as you say, there are cancer vaccines, mRNA vaccines, and other cancer vaccines being developed. There are new studies now to detect cancer in the bloodstream years before you have any symptoms. So the ability to begin to treat cancer before it even appears. There's a new radiation treatment in development. It's a flash of radiation that's literally a microsecond, and that's it. And so rather than a prolonged radiation treatment, which causes all sorts of damage to the surrounding tissue, it just hits the spot and just in an instant. And you're done. And as I was telling you before, immunotherapy is this incredibly promising area. So there's so much going on right now. It's a really exciting time for cancer research, but of course, it's also a terrifying time for cancer researchers.
So let's talk a little bit about kind of the politics and the motivation of the president's cuts on this. I mean, even as you describe, if the NIH stopped taking meetings well before kind of DOGE came in, this seems like part of an orchestrated plan on what to do.
This was a very deliberate and premeditated campaign. And it's not an easy thing to do because the NIH and the NCI, the National Cancer Institute, which is part of the NIH, which kind of oversees a lot of the cancer research in this country, they were built to be insulated from politics for obvious reasons. So if you wanted to make a sort of politically motivated assault on these institutions, it was going to require some forethought, and that's what happened. I mean, this administration came in and they knew exactly what to do and how they were going to do it, and they started freezing grants. I mean, it's unprecedented for active research grants to be canceled. I mean, truly unprecedented, and it was happening by the hundreds. It's unprecedented for universities to have their funding frozen. So this administration, they knew how to disrupt this system, and they did. And what's puzzling to me is you can explain this, I think, as, okay, this is part of the war on government bureaucracy, on what they would say is argue is government waste. This is part of the war on research universities that they feel are too progressive, too left. This is also important to say. This is part of a kind of attack on the scientific establishment, which of course has lost a lot of its credibility in many quarters during the COVID pandemic. I get that, but what's your plan? What are you going to, once you've canceled all these grants, once you've cut all this funding, what are you going to do? I mean, are we just going to concede the fact that we are going to, essentially surrender the war on cancer? I mean, or is there a plan that you just haven't told the American people about to build something in its place? And unfortunately, I haven't seen any evidence of a plan.
You have a statement from the Office of Management Budget. It says, efforts to focus NIH spending will establish a more sustainable and accountable fiscal path for NIH while ensuring that resources are managed effectively and in a manner that best supports America's biomedical research enterprise. You lay out kind of one of the critiques by Joe Lonsdale, a supporter of Elon Musk and the president. And he says, look, this is a a system that's grown bloated and bureaucratic, and it's not working nearly as fast as it could, and they want to change things. So what's the problem with that critique?
It is very important to recognize that this is not a perfect system by any means. There are criticisms of it both on the left and the right. Any bureaucratic system that has been evolving for more than 50 years now, it has gotten big, it has gotten unwieldy, it has gotten risk averse. There are too many older scientists who are blocking too many younger scientists who have kind of more potentially game-changing ideas, who are more familiar with new technology, et cetera, that are not able to kind of enter the field. And scientists are spending too much of their time writing grant proposals because it's gotten so competitive. That's a problem. They should be in the lab. They shouldn't be spending all their hours, writing 120-page proposals for a grant. So that is all true, and Joe Lonsdale is correct about that. I think the problem is that this idea that you can just sort of disrupt this system, like you would disrupt the technology industry, and replace it with startup companies. That's not how scientific research works. It's one scientist in one lab making a small discovery and publishing it in a paper, and another scientist reading that paper and seeing, oh, that's interesting. I think I might be able to add a twist to that. I might be able to advance that idea a little further. It's collaborative. It's incremental. It's very different than how the Silicon Valley functions. So I would say that I think his criticisms of the system are legitimate. I think the idea that it could be replaced by some sort of disruption-centered Silicon Valley style approach seems misguided to me. To say nothing of the fact that, as I mentioned before, we haven't seen any proposal for what's coming next.
Are people today suffering from the cuts that are coming to cancer research?
So there are isolated examples of that happening. The chief of surgery at the National Cancer Institute, who's running a clinical trial now to treat a particular form of cancer with immunotherapy, a form of cancer that has not yet been successfully treated with immunotherapy. And two of his technicians who manufacture the cells he needs to inject in his patients to treat them, and these are late-stage cancer patients. These two technicians were laid off, so that delayed the treatment of his patients, delayed his clinical trials. So yes. The bigger issue, though, is the way this system is structured. The government funds the early stage research that no pharmaceutical company or biotechnology company is going to invest in, because it's experimental, it's sort of basic, it's foundational. When it's investigative, then you get patents, then you get biotechnology companies, then you get private investment. What we're seeing now will ultimately result in a slowing of that survival rate, because progress at this early stage is what leads to the great breakthroughs in treatments, the great successful clinical trials in humans. But if you take away that foundational research that only the government will pay for, no private industry doesn't want to pay for it, because it's too speculative. And we're seeing this system kind of being attacked at this very foundational level, and we won't really know the effects of it for years to come.
Staff writer at the New York Times Magazine, Jonathan Mahler, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.